an expedition team ventured deep into the Amazon rainforest. Their sole purpose was to find the legendary moon tear tree. Rumor had it that its petals could cure all diseases. Eating 3 of them could even grant eternal life. But for Rick, all he cared about was whether his daughter could survive. Since his daughter had an incurable disease, obtaining the petals became his only hope of saving her. However, the rainforest was fraught with dangers. In just 3 days, the 20-person team was reduced to only him. Rick collapsed to the ground. Even breathing used up all his strength. Fortunately, a group of indigenous people found him. They gave Rick a mysterious liquid to drink. His broken body quickly recovered. In return, Rick shared modern knowledge with them. Later, other team members were rescued one after another. Among them was Rick's younger brother, Jonathan. Their arrival filled the entire tribe with vitality. Yet everything changed when Rick learned that the mysterious liquid the indigenous people had fed him was brewed from the petals of the moon tear tree. That night, Rick asked the chief for the petals. He was rejected on the spot. Furious, Rick stabbed the chief. Then he directly searched for the petals, but couldn't find any petals of the moon tear tree. So, he stopped the chief's daughter. He forced her to provide clues. Jonathan didn't want to see his brother go further astray, so he tackled Rick to the ground. But in the next second, Rick stabbed Jonathan through the heart with a knife. To save his daughter, he was willing to become a murderous devil. The hunt for the chief's daughter continued. All her tribesmen had already died a tragic death. To protect his daughter, the chief sacrificed his life to cast a curse on all members of the expedition team. The curse made them never able to leave the Amazon River. When Rick found the chief's daughter, the curse took effect just in time. A large number of poisonous snakes invaded his body. In the next second, countless vines dragged him into the ground, and the chief's daughter disappeared without a trace from then on. It wasn't until 400 years later, someone dug up a mysterious arrowhead in the Amazon River. This arrowhead was the key to finding the moon tear tree. At this time, at the Anthropological Research Association in London, Logan was holding a meeting. He planned to form an expedition team. The team would venture deep into the Amazon rainforest. Using the arrowhead, they would search for the legendary moon tear tree. On the other side, Logan's sister Annie sneaked into the archives. She wanted to steal the arrowhead. But just then, Michael, the association's investor, walked in. He opened the wooden box. He immediately found that the arrowhead was missing. So Annie had to reveal herself. But she didn't plan to give up without a fight. Annie grabbed a ladder. She wreaked havoc in the archives. Just as she was about to escape, she accidentally fell out of the window. At the same time, Logan happened to leave the association. Seeing his sister about to fall from the 5th floor, he quickly stopped the bus. This allowed Annie to land safely. Then the two got on the bus. They fled the scene. It turned out that this was all part of their plan. Later, Annie and Logan arrived at the Amazon River basin. They decided to rent a boat. They wanted to find the legendary moon tear tree. Before long, Annie found Captain Johnson in a tavern. She used tourism as an excuse, but Johnson only glanced at the destination. He immediately knew that Annie wanted to find the moon tear tree, so he asked for $50 million. As soon as Johnson finished speaking, Annie was about to turn around and leave. Just then, Johnson noticed the arrowhead she was wearing around her neck, so he stood up immediately. He claimed that he only wanted $10,000. However, in the next second, a jaguar suddenly burst into the scene, who wanted to attack them. Johnson immediately wrestled with it. Then he seized the opportunity. He threw a piece of beef to distract the jaguar away. Seeing how powerful Johnson was, Annie immediately agreed to the $10,000 reward. However, she didn't know that this jaguar was actually Johnson's pet. The earlier tavern attack was just a trick for Johnson to avoid paying the bill. Before long, Annie and Logan boarded Johnson's ship, the Goddess of the Moon. But right behind them, a huge submarine suddenly surfaced. Unexpectedly, Michael had tracked them down. He swore to retrieve the arrowhead. Johnson's Goddess of the Moon couldn't withstand Michael's submarine's machine gun fire at all. Everyone had to flee around the ship. In the next second, a torpedo was fired at the Goddess of the Moon. Realizing there was no way to escape, Johnson pushed the ship to full speed. This made the ship leave the water briefly. Only then did they finally avoid the torpedo attack. Later, Johnson dropped anchor hooks. This completely disabled Michael's submarine. Their journey to the Amazon finally officially began. After a while, Annie saw a pink dolphin. It was a creature that only existed in books. However, Johnson warned her. He told her not to look into the dolphin's eyes. The locals called them devil spirits. Once you looked into their eyes, you would fall into an endless nightmare. In fact, the dangers were far more than that. Whether it was the colorful small frogs, or the mice hiding in the trees, the venom on their bodies was enough to kill 100 people. Even the creatures randomly fished out of the river were all ferocious piranhas. But today, these piranhas would all become a delicious dinner. That night, Annie and Johnson chatted on the deck. Logan planned to go back to his room to sleep. Johnson told him that he must not enter the lowest level room. Originally, Logan had no intention of doing so, but after hearing what Johnson said, he decided to go down and take a look. So not long after, a jaguar jumped out. It chased Logan out of the cabin. Only then did Annie realize that she had been tricked. But she had already boarded Johnson's ship. There was no turning back. At the same time, Michael was also looking for the moon tear tree. He had no arrowhead to guide him. He didn't even know where Annie was, but he was still calm, because he had already found a more reliable guide. Before long, Michael took his men to a cave. The cave walls were covered with vines. Inside were petrified corpses. Later, Michael dripped Amazon River water on the corpses. In the next second, a poisonous snake suddenly jumped out. It instantly killed the man next to him. It turned out that this was the guide Michael wanted to find. It was Rick, who had been cursed 400 years ago. Due to the curse, Rick would be petrified immediately once he left the Amazon River. Now, Michael decided to blow up the river channel. He wanted to divert the river water here. At that time, all the petrified corpses would be resurrected, and their goal was also to find the moon tear tree, because the tree's petals were the only way to break the curse. The next day, Johnson, who knew nothing about this, was still sailing on the Amazon River. He closed all the windows. He was ready to sail into the river channel's most dangerous section. Johnson skillfully turned the helm. He seemed to have sailed this dangerous river channel tens of thousands of times. Even though there was a 30,000-foot cliff right in front of him, he still operated calmly. He successfully navigated to the adjacent river channel. After passing through the dangerous section, Annie was completely impressed by him. Their relationship also grew closer. Later, Johnson took Logan into the jungle to collect wood. Their goddess of the moon was in urgent need of repairs, and Annie, who was on the ship, took the opportunity to trick the jaguar away. She used tools to pry open the door of the lowest level room. The scene in front of her shocked her. It turned out that Johnson had collected a lot of information about the moon tear tree, but he had never mentioned it to her. Annie was angry at being tricked. She didn't understand why Johnson was full of secrets. Just as the two were arguing fiercely, Logan on the ship was suddenly shot by an arrow. When Annie went forward to check, she was also shot. Johnson quickly rushed over, but he also fell under the indigenous people's arrows. When the three woke up again, they were already inside a giant tree. Due to the language barrier, Johnson became the temporary translator. The indigenous chief demanded that Annie hand over the arrowhead, otherwise everyone would die. However, Annie refused to comply even if it meant death. In the next second, she broke free from the rope she had already cut, but she turned around and punched Johnson. It turned out that Annie had long seen through that the indigenous people and Johnson were in cahoots. Their clumsy acting was full of flaws, but to their surprise, the chief could understand the characters on the arrowhead. According to the clues on the characters, the three found the location of the moon tear tree on the map. However, just as everyone was about to leave, a poisonous snake suddenly jumped out. It instantly killed an indigenous person. Unexpectedly, Rick had caught up with Annie so quickly. Not only that, three strange people trapped in the curse also arrived here. Their bodies had long been corroded. Their flesh had merged with natural substances. Facing these immortals, everyone was powerless to resist. The arrowhead was quickly snatched away. Seeing this, Johnson immediately fought Rick, but he was stabbed through the heart by Rick's sword. Before dying, Johnson grabbed the arrowhead back and threw it to Annie. Then he fell from a height. Annie and Logan didn't have time to grieve. They immediately took the arrowhead and fled into the jungle. As long as they left the Amazon River, Rick and the others would be unable to chase them because of the curse. The next morning, Annie found Johnson lying by the river. He was actually not dead. Annie was overjoyed, but Logan was very nervous because the sword was still stuck in Johnson's heart. Johnson saw that he couldn't hide it anymore, so he had to tell them the truth. It turned out that Johnson had also been cursed 400 years ago. He was Rick's younger brother, Jonathan. Perhaps because of his act of saving the chief's daughter back then, Johnson hadn't turned into a monster now, but he also couldn't leave the Amazon River too far. Later, Logan had an allergic reaction. He had to leave the two and go to the hospital, and Johnson and Annie also successfully reached their destination. Later, they found a mechanism under the water, but the narrow passage was only accessible to Annie, and once she entered, the passage would be sealed. So to activate the mechanism, Johnson helped Annie breathe with his mouth. With their close cooperation, they successfully activated the mechanism. However, what greeted them was Michael's team. It turned out that Michael had captured Logan. Under Michael's coercion, Johnson and Annie had to lead the way. Soon, everyone successfully found the moon tear tree, but when Michael touched the tree roots, the roots immediately turned to powder. It turned out that as early as 400 years ago, the moon tear tree had already died. Michael threatened Annie. He told her to find a way to resurrect the moon tear tree, otherwise everyone would die. At this time, Annie looked at the huge circular hole in the dome. She immediately realized that this might be related to the moon. She found a new mechanism based on the moonlight. The gap on it perfectly matched the arrowhead. In the next second, the entire moon tear tree was lit up. The branches were covered with petals. Just then, Annie grabbed a pistol, but she fired at Johnson. She let him fall into the river. Then, she showed a sinister smile. She told Michael that there was one fewer person to share the benefits with. At this time, Michael didn't know that all of this was part of their plan. On the other side, Johnson arrived at Logan's side. He easily rescued Logan, who was being guarded, but the sound of the fight still attracted Michael's attention. At the same time, Annie took the opportunity to escape to the upper level. She needed to pick the petals of the moon tear tree before the moonlight disappeared. Finally, at the last moment, Annie successfully obtained a petal. With this petal alone, humans could develop a real immortality drug. Seeing Michael about to rush over, Annie threw the petal to Johnson. In the next second, Rick and the others also appeared here. They killed Michael, who was in the way. Then they chased after Johnson, who had the petal. So, the three strange people successfully subdued Johnson, but the petal had already been handed to Annie by him. Johnson himself planned to die together with the strange people. So, The ship crashed into the stone pillars. This blocked the river channel. Without the cover of the Amazon River water, the strange people trapped in the curse were immediately entangled by vines. Their bodies also turned to stone. Of course, Johnson was no exception this time. Annie looked at Johnson, who had turned to stone. Then she took out the petal. As long as she fed the petal to Johnson, he could break the curse. But humans would also lose the chance to develop the immortality drug. Annie didn't hesitate. She fed the petal to Johnson. Soon, cracks appeared on the stone. Johnson was successfully resurrected. This time, he became a normal human who could bleed. In the end, the three of them, along with the jaguar, embarked on a new journey. If you were given the same chance, would you choose to use the petals to save your loved one, or all of humanity, or would you keep them for yourself?